I'm going to be talking about masculinity and manliness, because that is a key theme in A View from the Bridge, and it is a possibility that it will come up as one of the questions. Now, if you're talking about a theme in the text, I imagine that you'll have enough time to probably write between 4 and 5 points. So I'm going to talk about a few points that are related to masculinity and manliness, and then when you're planning your essays, obviously what you will do is pick whatever key points you like the best and you think you could write most effectively about. Whatever points you do make, you will need to select quotes. So it's really important that you pick the points that you can find quotes for quickly in the exam, because or remember them even better, because you don't want to be wasting time trying to find quotes. So let's start on masculinity. Well, the first thing is that our key character is Eddie. Now, Eddie is a longshoreman, which by its very nature is a masculine job because, one, he's providing for his family, as was typical for a 1950s American man. And secondly, he's got a job that involves a lot of physicality, and therefore he is deemed to be strong. And in fact, in the stage directions, he's described as husky, although slightly overweight. So it's almost like he is physical and he is strong, but he's not at his physical peak. And perhaps that might be because he is 40, and so he's not a really very young man anymore. However, he certainly values masculinity and views himself very much as the man of the house. And indeed, when he arrives home in that very first sequence, he is definitely the man that everybody tries to please. And in fact, when Catherine talks to him about her dress, she is almost in tears. That's a quote, almost in tears, and that's because he disapproves. So he's very used to being in control, and that control is obviously typically a masculine trait. Now, one of the things that is interesting about Eddie is that he immediately takes a dislike for Rodolfo. Now, Rodolfo is the complete opposite. He's almost effeminate in the way that he behaves. He isn't particularly masculine at all, and lacks this manliness that Eddie respects. Now, this is difficult for Eddie because it challenges his view of what a man should be. And in fact, Rodolfo helps Beatrice with the coffee very early on. And obviously he sings and he can dance, and he sings to Catherine, who says that it's beautiful and that it's terrific. And Eddie struggles with this because it doesn't match with what he genuinely perceives to be what a masculine man is, and therefore he presumes that Rodolfo is a homosexual. Actually, it's made pretty clear in the play that Rodolfo isn't homosexual and that he is in love with Catherine, but in Eddie's world, unless you are a masculine man, because he works with sailors and people who unload ships, unless you're a masculine man, in his view, that means that you ain't right. And that's, again, a quote. This is contrasted with Marco, who is obviously Rodolfo's brother, who's an extraordinarily strong man. And in fact, he's admired by the other people who say that he's extraordinarily strong and that he could have unloaded an entire ship by himself if he was just left to do it. And that means that Eddie respects Marco in a way that he doesn't respect Rodolfo. And indeed, really early on in the play, you see this simply through their interactions at the very start, when Eddie, through the stage directions, it says that Eddie is more and more coming to address Marco only. Now, he doesn't really know Rodolfo or Marco at that point, and so one can presume that the reason he's addressing Marco is because he sees him as the older brother, the more masculine of the two, and therefore the person that he has respect for. What is interesting about this is that Eddie, almost to prove his dominance over Rodolfo, challenges him to a boxing little fight in their living room. Now, he tries to teach Rodolfo to be a little bit more manly and shows him a couple of passes. That's a quote again. And what is interesting is it's in this sequence, Eddie presents himself as a teacher immediately superior to his student Rodolfo, but really the superiority is the fact that he is stronger than him, and he is trying to show both Catherine and Beatrice that he is the stronger man, and almost trying to prove it to himself because he feels that Rodolfo has one up on him because Catherine thinks he's so wonderful. And so the only way that Eddie knows to get one up is to be physical, and that's really difficult because that isn't what Catherine is interested in. what follows is that Marco is a little bit, I guess, cross, put out by the fact that Eddie's hit his brother. And so there's a really important moment where Marco challenges Eddie to pick up the chair by the bottom of the chair. Now, this is a really important symbolic moment in the play, because essentially it's Marco saying to Eddie, I am stronger than you, I'm more masculine than you, and I am dominant over you. And Eddie really struggles with that. And at that moment, that's a really key moment, because his relationship, Marco's relationship with Eddie, is almost broken, and the positive relationship that they've built up is essentially destroyed because Eddie now resents Marco as well. So he, interestingly, Eddie ends up at the end, by the end of Act 1, resenting Rodolfo because he's effeminate and womanlike, and he ends up resenting Marco because he's masculine and manly. And that's a kind of odd scenario that he finds himself in. When the chair is lifted up over Eddie's head, it's almost a symbolic warning. And this is foreshadowing for what happens later on in the play, where Marco says, I am dominant over you, and it doesn't matter how nasty you are, as in trying to fight with Rodolfo, I am stronger than you and I will win. And obviously, later on in the play, Eddie tries to be the stronger man, and obviously that ends in tragedy. It is interesting as well when towards the end of the play, finally, Eddie takes the fight out to Marco, and he goes outside and he lifts and opens his arms and takes this fighting stance. He is trying to prove to the neighbourhood by going outside into a public arena that he is a confident, dominant man, and that he deserves his reputation. He repeats, I want my name, and part of that reputation is about him being physically stronger than Marco, for whom he believes has ruined his reputation by saying that he has killed his family by calling the immigration office, which Eddie denies. And what's interesting is that Eddie is almost aware of his own lack of strength at this point, and his lack of masculinity in comparison to Marco, because he takes a knife. And that knife is certainly symbolic of Eddie's fatal flaw. And it's turned upon himself, and then obviously he ends up dead. But it's important that Eddie is aware that his own weakness, that he needed to take a knife out to challenge Marco, and that he couldn't just fight him using his own bare hands. In the play as well, if we're talking about masculinity and manliness, it is very important that we talk about sexuality. Now, already I've touched on the fact that Eddie doesn't like Rodolfo because he perceives him to be homosexual, but actually the only person that Eddie has, the only person really who's got a problem with their sexuality is Eddie, because Eddie is obviously sexually attracted to his niece, which isn't okay, and unfortunately for him, that makes him feel emasculated, because as a result he doesn't want to have sex with his wife Beatrice, and Beatrice says, this is a quote, when am I going to be a wife again, Eddie? And that's extraordinarily emasculating for Eddie, because essentially she's saying that he's not doing his job as a man. He's not having sex with her and doing what a man should do in the 1950s, and as a result he feels emasculated, and this makes him feel more angry and more frustrated. And because he doesn't want to admit his feelings for Catherine, unfortunately he ends up getting more and more frustrated, and he doesn't want to admit that's why he doesn't want to have sex with his wife, and so he starts to feel emasculated, and he can't quite put his finger on why that is, but he feels frustrated by it. The only other real explorations of masculinity that I would probably want to talk about would be the interactions with Alfieri that Eddie has. There are a couple of things. That one, when he talks about Rodolfo with Alfieri, he talks about that the other men on the ships are laughing at him on the piers. That's a quote, and he says, "I'm ashamed." And it does seem that Eddie gets an awful lot of his pride out of the fact that he is a strong man, and that he has done what a true, in his eyes, Italian or American man should do in the 50s, which is support his family and be strong. and he feels ashamed because people are laughing at Rodolfo, and they call him the paper doll. And he finds that embarrassing because it's almost an insult to his own masculinity, because Rodolfo is part of his family. And what's difficult for Eddie is that he feels that Rodolfo is so much weaker than him physically, and yet he is able to steal from him, and he says that to Alfieri, that he is stealing from him the one thing that he cherishes, which is Catherine. And that's a real challenge to Eddie's masculinity, because the one thing that he wants is being taken from him, but his physicality, which is the only thing he really has in his armoury, is not enough to keep Catherine. So to conclude, manliness and masculinity actually in many respects is really negative in the play, because it fuels the pride and it fuels the conflict, which essentially ends up in the tragic death of Eddie.